Thank you very much, all of you, for sacrificing your Friday afternoon. The organizers, and in particular David, for inviting me, and all the panelists who spoke before me. I do hope that what I have to say resonates with earlier talks. I think it does. This talk builds on the larger project that David briefly mentioned, which tries to trace continental European structures of racialization, which are of course interdependent with other Western models of racialization, in particular British and US, but are also particular in important ways. And one of them, I would argue, is that racialization in continental Europe, because of the particular configurations of race, religion, colonialism, sexuality, nation, and Europeanness, produces an externalization rather than a subordination of racialized populations. So racialized populations continue to be categorized as non-European or permanent migrants. And that constructs Europeans of color as a contradiction in terms, by placing them in what I would call a queer space and time constellation that in turn provides, I argue, the foundation for a particular kind of resistance that I call the queering of ethnicity. So what I'll do is briefly sketch this larger framework, then explore the role of class, gender, and sexuality in the current racing of religion with regard to European Muslims. And I end by pointing to a tradition of radical cultural activisms around issues of European identity that originated in exactly the communities of color that in current European discourses remain firmly on the outside. So while there are, of course, important national particulars, not every European nation deals with these issues in the same way. I think it's still possible and, in fact, important to identify certain structures that exist across Europe. And to summarize them in a couple of broader claims, the first would be that Europe in its national, but also in its post-national European Union and so on, variations is maintaining a normalized Christian or Christianized secular whiteness through an ideology of colorblindness that claims not to see racialized difference and thus both stabilizes and silences race as a framework inherent to Europe, while using race expressed currently mostly through religion or culture to constantly produce non-white populations as necessarily non-European. In European discourse, be it legally, culturally, socially, economically, or academic, the term migrant describes someone who moves across borders, but also all racialized European communities who are reframed as non-European through their ascribed permanent status as migrating from somewhere not Europe, a status that is transmitted across generations and thus increasingly decoupled from the actual event of migration, shifting the meaning of migrant from a term indicating movement to one indicating a static, hereditary status. That is, movement into Europeanness is impossible as long as racialized difference is still visible. Racialized populations are thus positioned within a spatial and temporal paradox. They are permanently frozen in the moment of arrival. And the further away the actual moment or movement of migration, the stronger the paradox, that is, the queerness of their presence in space and time. The current so-called third and fourth generation of post-war labor and post-colonial migrants is perceived to be more alien and out of place in time in Europe than their grandparents, the first generation of actual migrants, exactly because they are made impossible as an internal presence within and by the ideology of normalized colorblindness places race, and thus racialized populations necessarily outside of Europe. As a result, race and, of course, racism become fundamentally un-European. Many white Europeans go as far as to claim that they don't understand race, usually when referencing a supposed American obsession with it. Europeans tend to see the relevance of race as one of the central differences between Europe and the United States, usually the importance of religion in public life is the other. At first glance, it might indeed seem as if Europe is outside of the US-American post-racial temporality. Well, the latter is built on a narrative of having successfully overcome and redressed racial inequality. The myth of European colorblindness claims that Europe never was racial, and anti-Semitism is often presented both as an exception and as clearly separable from racism. Thus, despite the origin of the very concept of race in Europe and the explicitly race-based policies of both its fascist regimes and colonial empires, the continent often is marginal at best in discourses on race, in particular with regard to contemporary formations, which are often closely identified with the US as center of both explicit race discourse and of resistance to it. Attempts at pointing to the important role of race and racism in Europe is frequently framed as enforcing an Americanized political correctness meant to silence necessary critiques of migrant communities, a term covering all groups not perceived as European, including racialized Europeans, and their supposed innate intolerance expressed primarily in violent sexism and homophobia. This is a move that allows to present Europe as more tolerant than both the US, plagued by racism, and the global South, plagued by all kinds of intolerance. This also makes it hard to challenge, of course, the colorblind narrative from within a continental European theoretical framework which constantly externalizes race and places it outside of the domain of what needs to be theorized. As a result, the continental European left has not produced a theory of racialization. Instead, class is considered central, which is, of course, quite ironic since class is deeply racialized in Europe. And if you've been here for the whole day and heard Meister's presentation, one of the results of this lack of a theorization of race are these constant awkward attempts at anti-racism that produce exactly the opposite, but are still considered progress because at least Europeans are trying. And I don't really want to go into that, but just to quickly make the point that race is, of course, internal to Europe. One example is blackface, which exists all across Europe, which is, over the last maybe 10, 15 years, maybe 10 years, challenged in a broader transnational framework, and the responses are pretty much always the same. It's art, it's cultural, this is Europe and not the US, so blackface has no racist tradition. This is an example of it's cultural, it's part of our tradition, from the Netherlands, where Santa Claus has a black companion called Zwarte Piet, and what that means is that starting November, if you go out in the Netherlands, you will run into people in blackface everywhere. When I lived in Amsterdam, I went to my organic store around the corner, and the very white hippie there was dressed like that with a blackface. And this has been criticized by black people in the Netherlands for at least 25 years, but it hasn't produced. This is an example of its art. There are a number of instances of various Vogue Europe issues that featured white models in blackface. Vogue Italy did it, Vogue France. I think this is also from the Dutch issue, I'm not sure. There are tons of other examples. But what happens is that they are treated constantly as exceptions that are not relevant. This is a political poster from the Switzerland just to emphasize the point that, of course, the connotation of black is racialized. So what you see here is a Swiss flag, 3 white sheep kicking a black sheep off the flag. I leave the interpretation to you. This is something that is not only part of nationalist and conservative discourse, it very much also involves queer and feminist activists and intellectuals, which play a key role in disciplining racialized communities, contributing to a narrative of Europe as threatened by, on the one hand, cultural and intellectual Americanization and political correctness, and on the other, by an anti-Enlightenment migrant fundamentalism that places the continent in the position of a victim, occupied with defending its values rather than imposing them on others. This is visible in particular in the thoroughly mainstreamed claims to the continent's imminent Islamization, while Muslims make up around 5% of the population in most European nations. And just as a quick illustration, this is another poster from the same Swiss Nationalist Party that is more explicit in its attack on, or in its claim that really that Muslims attack Europe. This anxiety around Muslim or Europeans makes more sense if one sees it as the outcome of the need to accept Islam as a European minority religion, and consequently the need to accept its permanent public presence in the shape of mosques, halal butchers, or hijabs. This fear of the internal other is made explicit in the declaration of the end of multiculturalism in 2010, both by British Prime Minister Cameron and German Chancellor Merkel, meaning the end of tolerance for those never considered real Europeans in the first place, now offered the impossible choice of assimilation into a racialized system dependent on their exclusion, or to leave Europe and go home, never mind that Europe is their home. It is noteworthy that the consensus on the failure of multiculturalism targeting the second, third, and fourth generation as permanently displaced coincided with the rise in native so-called migrant populations, born and raised in Europe, whose very presence defies the existing categories, thus producing what I call a queering of ethnicity by violating what is considered normative. It is necessary to question the very notion of this multiculturalism, whose failure is almost universally agreed on, and for which minoritarian cultures are blamed, but it's also necessary to ask what will replace this superficially inclusive model of racialized domination in Europe and potentially in other parts of the so-called post-racial West. The rise of the US empire and neoliberal multiculturalism in the second half of the 20th century coincided with the Cold War reordering of Europe into West and East, the loss of colonial empires, and after 1990, another reordering, collapsing Europe more or less into the European Union. The latter came to symbolize Europe's successful reformation after the 20th century crises of totalitarianism, confirming the continent's place as center and gatekeeper of universal human rights, manifest in the location of the International Criminal Court, which could have been housed nowhere but in West Europe. Is the only space in the world that is by definition exempt from the possibility of grave human rights violations. In other words, simultaneous with the rise of the US as new global power, Western Europe, primarily through the European Union, reconfigured itself as reformed without interest in world domination, but still uniquely equipped to lead by example, namely by embodying an advanced stage of development others are still aspiring to reach. This notion of a linearly progressing global time is, as Johannes Fabian and others have shown, tied to a spatial ordering of the world that places Europe at the center of a universal time and space, conceiving of the rest of the world only in relation to the center, a Weberian ideal type against which everything else is unfavorably measured. With the end of World War II, decolonization, and the beginning of large-scale labor migration, according to Fabian, I quote, the necessity arose to provide an objective, transcultural temporal medium for theories of change that were to dominate Western social science in the decades that followed, end quote. The increasing interaction outside of the strict boundaries of colonialism of societies placed in different developmental stages was thus framed around the idea of a public time, which is a kind of twilight zone, in which different time-space constellations interact, allowing non-Western societies to see their future and move towards it with the help of organization regulating international public time and space, such as the United Nations or the IMF, while simultaneously allowing the West an educational glimpse at its own path. And we heard earlier that the Occupy movement really started in Spain. I would go further and say it really started in Tunisia, or if you assume that the mass mobilization behind it is a reaction to structural adjustment programs, it started earlier again in Latin America. And that was something that was quite present in the early representations of the indignados, even of the Occupy movement. But at a certain point it turned around, and now we talk about a global Occupy movement, right? As if it started in the US and not ended here. And I think that is not coincidental, that is symptomatic of this linear progressive time in which the West always has to be the beginning of progress. It can start somewhere else and then the West catches up, right? So you have this linear time in which the West is the present, everything else is the past, and interventions into this past in the form of interventions into the internal affairs of nations of the global South are increasingly framed as humanitarian, led by the United States multicultural anti-racist empire and supported by Europe's, thank you. The two major NATO interventions after the fall of the Soviet Empire, Kosovo and Iraq, were both quite explicitly framed as a restaging of the Second World War. In the first case with the Serbs presenting the Nazis, in the second case with a quite explicit identification of Saddam Hussein with Hitler. So what happens is that again, the West unites to save the world from fascism. So what that allows this continued reference to a past in which the leading role of the West has already been affirmed is to allow to continue this leading role in the present. So the relational model of space and time did not vanish with the end of explicitly race-based forms of governance, be it colonialism or white supremacy in the US, and the shift to neoliberal multiculturalism, nor with the growing presence of non-white, non-Christian populations in post-war Europe. And this is in part the case because this global spatio-temporal hierarchy always also was a means to internally structure Europe and its others. Europe, of course, is a space that is complicated in part by the fact that it's impossible to really define its borders, which makes the position of its periphery always ambiguous. The characterization of Eastern and Southern Europeans as potentially off-white, tainted with Asiatic, African blood, and so on, was part of 19th century scientific racism that laid the foundation for the modern racial hierarchy, and it reappeared in the racialization of Italian, Spanish, Greek, Portuguese, and so on, guest workers coming to the West in the 50s and 60s. And while in the 90s, they were retrospectively declared unambiguously European, namely Christian, when the focus shifted to Muslims as European others, this was an inclusion that was only tentative, as you can see now with the economic crisis, which again divides Europe in a northwestern center and a southeastern periphery. But what reunites center and periphery is an understanding of embodied, racialized, spatio-temporal difference, creating minority populations perceived to be permanently and necessarily out of time and place. And this population at the moment is largely identified with Muslims, but it includes all racialized communities. Roma, Jews, Afro-Europeans, Muslims were never allowed full insider status. And while you can argue that Jews at this point have become European, the notion of a Judeo-Christian history that is more and more frequently evoked right now is really not a description of that past, but a reaction to the present, namely to the presence of Muslims in Europe, and it erases the actually quite violent history that of course meant exclusion and persecution of racialized Jews in Europe. The particular histories of colonialism, racism, and migration in Europe create intersections and overlaps, in particular between Black, Muslim, and Roma communities who often share spaces, cultures, histories, and positionalities. These connections are suppressed in dominant policy-producing discourses, which instead assign each group a very distinct role. Muslims represent the other that is already inside, but will always remain foreign, whereas Africans, which includes Black Europeans, represent the other that's not yet here, but pushing at the border. So Africa as the demographic and racial Goliath threatening the European David, which is a kind of metaphorical construct that of course justifies the very aggressive border policies that cost the life of around 5,000 people each year, most of them coming from Africa. Roma, finally, are the quintessential European minority of color, really, with a 500-year history that includes slavery and genocide, and a present that is still shaped by violence, poverty, and exclusion. But Roma are really almost absent as a recognized presence in contemporary Europe. Instead, they are framed as not only coming from another non-European space, but also from another time, namely Europe's past. So in European folklore, you have an abundance of representations of gypsies. In that sense, they embody this spatial temporal order in which non-whiteness is not only equated with non-Europeanness, but also with being pre-modern, which of course in many ways is exactly the position that indigenous populations are assigned in settler colonies, absent in the present but central to its past. The discursive separation of Roma, Muslims, and Blacks, while they all share deep European roots, is symptomatic for the ways in which intersections of communities of color with each other, as well as with white Europe, are negated within the ideology of colorblindness, which cannot allow for porous boundaries and instead has to continuously produce distinct and homogeneous communities. The ways in which larger societies constantly work to regulate access to the resources of the nation state through the production of national and increasingly continental identities is thus made invisible by the construction of static and exclusive cultures in which women play a central but heteronormous role, in part through what Anne McClintock, referencing Frantz Fanon, called the emotive politics of dress, which of course is clearly reflected in European discussions around gender and Islam, discussions that unfortunately completely ignore Fanon's insight into the visual and gendered nature of nationalism. And this is just one pretty blunt example of these emotive politics of dress from Denmark. So this is justice with a niqab. So what happens in this focus, in particular on the hijab, is that it's dehistoricized, decontextualized, and essentialized to serve as the key symbol of Muslim difference, as visible proof of an unacceptable dissonance, representing a static otherness expressed in parallel societies shaped by ancient Oriental rather than modern Western structures, underlining the perception that Muslims and Europeans are like oil and water, unable to mix. Instead, archaic Muslim enclaves are supposedly surviving unchanged within the larger European societies. European discourse, including its progressive and feminist variations, sees female Muslim mobility as a one-way street, leading to a point of no return. Once she time-traveled into Christianized secular modernity, the Muslima can never go back to a pre-enlightened state or to her community. And this is a notion that produced its own quite popular genre, which you could call escape narrative stories of ex-Muslimas who escape from their culture, from a repressive society, and enter modernity. And probably the most popular representative is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and this is the cover of a liberal Dutch magazine, which I assume considers itself quite clever, showing here Hirsi Ali freed of the hijab and instead with a symbol of Dutch femininity. This is a scene from the film Hirsi Ali did with Theo van Gogh, Submission. And this is the part that the ex-Muslima plays in this escape narrative. Due to her superior insider status, she is able to guide other women through this same journey out of oppression into modernity. Another proponent of this escape narrative is the Turkish-German liar Seyran Ateş, who authorized by her own suffering at the hands of her family, and my point is not to at all deny that this suffering took place. It's more about the ways that it's instrumentalized. She gave an interview that I think is quite symptomatic for the interaction of key talking points and the ways that new tropes can build on older ones by invoking an emotional response without the need for factual evidence. So I just want to quote a little bit out of that interview, where Ateş begins by saying, "Many Muslim women still live in archaic parallel worlds where structures dominate that are familiar to us from the Middle Ages." Can you quantify this? The journalist asked. How many migrants live in this parallel society? And Ateş replies, there are no studies, but my feeling is that at least 80% of the people coming to Germany from Turkey live in this parallel society. They never really arrived here, and that is transmitted to the next generation. The use of political time and space in this construct not only reduces world history to European history, the Middle Ages in question are decided Christian, inserting Islam into a Euro-Christian timeline that erases Islamic history. But of course, as Said observed to the Orientalists, Islam has no history. But it also creates a moral imperative for majoritarian Europeans to save their own culture from being destroyed by Muslims, and to save these Muslims from the culture pinning them down in a time that has passed centuries ago, but that they are nonetheless locked into. Islam, in other words, is transmitted from one generation to the next like a disease that can only be cured by a radical intervention that is complete assimilation of the infected patients, which of course includes a complete separation from Islam. Again, bringing home the notion that Europe and Islam are incompatible and European Muslims thus an oxymoron. This is in stark contrast to the actual negotiated mobility of the group that represents all Muslims for the European mass public, namely women wearing the headscarf. I would argue that it was their entrance into the center of the nation that prompted the anti-hijab backlash. The site of conflict are national institutions, schools, courthouses, the police force, hospitals. These are all spaces, in other words, that for decades had a strong presence of women wearing the headscarf, but these women were part of the cleaning force. In fact, that's one of the most common cliches about Muslim immigrants to Western Europe, the cleaning woman with the headscarf. And this cleaning woman was ridiculed, but she was not seen as a threat because her wearing the hijab fit into an earlier model of the headscarf, which was coded as poor, rural, backward, and applied not only to Muslim communities, but also to Southern Europeans and internally in Western Europe as a way to divide rural and urban. It became a symbol of Muslim inability to adapt to modernity, that is Europe, only once the hijab was associated with urban middle-class mobility. That is, once that women wearing the hijab entered these spaces in positions as lawyers, as policewomen, as doctors, where they could become representative of the nation or of Europe. So one could argue that the increasingly intense headscarf affairs signify the collapse of the boundary between Europe and Islam rather than an unbridgeable gap. However, the hijab as a sign of Europeanness is illegible or nonsensical within the dominant European discourse, and it becomes completely illegible when it combines a claim to Europeanness with a radical feminist critique of hegemonic constructs. And one of the examples for that I look at in my book is Asma Abdulhamid, who's a Palestinian, Danish activist, feminist socialist. And this is a poster that announces a campaign event when she was a candidate for the Socialist Party in the national Danish elections in 2008. And this is an event that takes place at Dunkelbar, which is one of the most popular queer clubs in Copenhagen. So the combination of a woman wearing hijab and a queer space, and I don't think that you can really read the names of the other people at the event, but it's pretty clear that at least a number of them are drag queens. So this is a combination that does not make sense within this larger discourse and leaves the feminist Muslima in a position of impossibility that is comparable to that of the queer Muslim, whose very existence is erased in the latest stage of the European clash with its others, in which implicitly straight Muslims and implicitly white queer community are pitted against each other. And an image that does make sense in this discourse is this, which is actually from the West End in London, from a largely Muslim neighborhood, announcing a gay-free zone. So this is considered symptomatic of this clash between Muslims here, queers there, and focusing on the city as a contested, racialized, and queered space in which Muslims invariably appear as illegitimate occupiers and intolerant invaders representing everything that queers come to the city to be safe from. And of course, again, in this dichotomy, class is erased as a relevant analytical category and replaced with a racialized notion of culture, which is exemplified in a racialized hate crime debate in which male Muslim youths appear as perpetrators, never as targets, and white middle-class gay men as the victims, creating a sense of acute crisis that adds urgency to the discourse on Europe's universalist secular identity being threatened by the particularist politics of the continent's Muslim minorities who position themselves in opposition to 21st century values of diversity, tolerance, and mobility. Against the backdrop of what I sketched so far, this crisis, however, appears as but one instance in the continuous externalization of racialized Europeans. While the focus is currently on Muslims, there are similar moral panics around African and Roma invasions of urban spaces, leading to state and mob violence across the continent. A violence, however, that is not produced by the difference of minorities, but is a means to produce racialized difference. Nonetheless, in all these instances, the violence against racialized groups is framed as a defensive action, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to defend Europe against the barbarians. As Tricker-Keaton observed for the French context, I quote, "The discourse of urban violence intensifies these tensions when a supposedly unsuspecting public is told that ultimately they will be victims of outer city use if they are not controlled and confined, while the degraded conditions typical of outer city public housing and schools in the other fronts are not understood as a form of violence," end quote. This fits into a larger narrative of Europe as always already on the defense against the foreign. Erasing it is producing initial structural violence, be it colonial or in the material living conditions of racialized communities permanently stuck in temporary housing projects created for guest workers decades ago, or in the violent gentrification of these spaces. Thus, the city is a site of resistance and primary source of spatial identification for communities of color is not a matter of choice, but the result of post-war labor recruitment to industrial metropolises, which with deindustrialization produced a multi-ethnic underclass concentrated in cities that offer a precarious form of belonging at best, containing the racial residue excluded from the terrain of cultural homogeneity constructed through the internalist narrative of national and supranational Europeanness. The seemingly fluid, but in fact strictly hierarchical spatial governance provided by the neoliberal creative city tolerates poor communities of color in its cityscape, but contains and isolates them to ensure that movement takes place only in one direction, conceiving of them primarily as a resource of labor, food, sex, and other commodities valued by the consumer citizen, including the queer consumer citizen, to whom the city appears as a space of liberation, endpoint in a narrative of progressive movement from past oppression and shame to liberation, pride, and future. That is a type of movement that complies with the larger Western narrative of inevitable progress, which is also reflected, of course, in the narrative of a successful migration from the backwards, primitive, non-European space to assimilation into the civilized West, but that is sharply contrasting with the mobility assigned to minorities, aimless, circular, excessive, endless, but never going anywhere, reflecting the peculiar spatio-temporal positioning of minorities as eternal migrants who never move. In this sense, to become properly gay, the racialized queer person has to perform a different kind of mobility, similar to the mobility that is offered to the Muslim woman, a variation of the coming out that means coming into an already liberated white queer community while permanently leaving behind communities of color and Islam, thereby proving that they are able to replace the excessive, unfocused, dangerous mobility ascribed to racialized minorities with a teleological movement towards liberation. My conclusion then is that this queerness in time and space, which is imposed rather than chosen, exactly because it is more pronounced for the current generation of Europeans of color, produces new strategies of resistance, which I summarize as the queering of ethnicity, that is a non-essentialist and non-linear political strategy, not based on racial identification, but on the shared experience of being racialized, resulting in a situational, potentially inclusive identity, creating bonds between various ethnicized and marginalized groups and offering some preliminary tools for theorizing positionality, legibility, and identity beyond Eurocentric universalism and nationalist essentialism. And this I see reflected in a kind of translocal European activism that emerged in the late 1980s, and the very same urban spaces that have become the prime site of the latest stage of the European clash with its others. For the hip-hop artists, feminist organizers, genderqueer performers, and migrant rights activists at the center of this loose coalition, spatial-temporal dislocation was not only a literary strategy, but a lived reality, produced by and producing particular material conditions and particular forms of artistic, often non-literary reflections, forms that embrace the ephemeral, non-linear, and heterotopic. And I just want to end by giving you a couple of brief examples. These people are members of an Amsterdam-based queer of color collective called Strange Fruit, which has mostly Muslim and black members, and that used performance, dance parties, flyers, posters to address topics ranging from HIV prevention for communities of color to immigration law and deportations, racial profiling, transphobia in queer communities, to racism among white progressive organizations. And one of the strategies they used was a kind of creolization of normative narratives by using cultural traditions. They replaced, for example, the coming out story that is usually an individualized linear narrative with Tories coming out of the Surinamese tradition, which are storytelling events that can only happen in communication between a narrator and an audience, and the position changes, thus both emphasizing the importance of community for queers of color and coming out as a process that can be much more circular than linear. This is Fatma Suad, which is she's a member of the Turkish-German genderqueer Salon Oriental duo, which is mostly known because they started a dance event in Berlin called Gay Hane, which is immensely popular, but what is less well known is that they started out with not really plays, but kinds of really trashy performances along the lines of what Jose Munoz calls queer drag, as opposed to gay drag, meaning a subversive kind of performance. And just to give you an idea of what they dealt with, they had a play called Fatma's Wedding, about two Turkish-German families who meet at the wedding of their children, who both happen to be queer. Another play was called What I Always Wanted to Know About Belly Dancing, addressing the appropriation of Middle Eastern cultures by Germans. Kidnapping of the Promise dealt with arranged marriages between Turkish-German men and Turkish women. Maria 2000 was a play in which trans women end heteronormative gender relations and bring about salvation by becoming able to bear children. Salon Oriental did not only start Gay Hane, they were also one of the sources for the nationwide Kanakatak movement in Germany, which was active mostly from the late 90s to the mid 2000s, refusing a culture of dialogue and staging interventions into public spaces that rejected the logic of progressive secular time, which is something that is reflected in the name of the group. Kanake is a very common German insult for people perceived to be as foreign. So it's not a matter of whether you are German or not, but whether you're considered part of the in-group or not. Is a term that comes from the German colonial history, but this is something that almost nobody using that term knows. The German colonial past has only recently and reluctantly been rediscovered by academia and the mainstream, and remains firmly situated in the past, allowing to continue to perceive race as something that was brought into the nation only recently through non-white migrants. But of course, the colloquial use of Kanake reflects a less neat temporality, one in which colonialism and the spatio-temporal order it produced refuse to stay outside of Europe or in the past. And this is something that is brought to the fore by Kanake attack. These groups' radically intersectional attack on normative binaries of nation, gender, and sexuality is born out of a shared experience of embodying an identity that is declared impossible, even though lived by millions, of constantly being defined as foreign to everything one is most familiar with. And while this practice is grounded less in theory than in the everyday experiences of the nominal second, third, fourth generation of migrants who fall between neat European divisions of insider and foreigner, it is in line with queer of color critique's resurrection of queer as a term of intersectional analysis, not merely synonymous with LGBT, but referencing processes of constructing normative and non-normative behaviors and populations, working with rather than against the complex, at times contradictory connections and coalitions the system of heteronormativity produces. And to quote Grace Hong and Rod Ferguson, one of the key authors of queer of color critique, the mobilization of difference by women of color feminism and queer of color critique is intended not to erase the differentials of power, value, and social death within and among groups, as in a multiculturalist model, but to highlight such differentials and to attempt to do the vexed work of forging a coalitional politics through these differences, end quote. The work of groups like Salon Oriental, Strange Fruit, or Kanake attack highlights the differentials of power produced by European discourses of belonging that tend to pit women and sexual minorities against racialized minorities, thus both denying and exploiting the intersections between these categories. Queerness becomes tolerable if it is perceived as being compatible with a neoliberal project that produces new forms of exclusion. And in the current European context, Muslims emerge as the group whose exclusion is necessary for the survival of the larger project of inclusive humanism. This trope can be reinforced quickly because it references well-known cliches perceived as truths, since they align with the overarching binary discourse affirming Europe's status as the center of progress and humanism. A successful challenge to this mechanism therefore requires a simultaneous engagement with all of these discursive tropes and their anchoring in European conceptions of public space and time used to subordinate the rest of the world and communities of color. And it's no coincidence, I would argue, that queer racialized Europeans perfectly representing the subaltern of contemporary European discourses around race, religion, and migration are at the center of this challenge. If Europeans of color are produced as queer, as a contradiction in terms, both spatially and temporally displaced within a heteronormative discourse of nation, gender, sexuality, and religion, a discourse that interacts and intersects with supranational liberal cosmopolitanisms and assigning people of color a position both outside of Europe and outside of modernity, then it should be possible to queer Europeanness from exactly this displaced perspective through an activism that rejects the universal timeline of linear progress and underlying space-time logics of modernity, replacing them with Edouard Glissant's situational communities and ideally supplemented with a scholarship mirroring its structures, allowing to explore connections between post-colonial African diaspora migration studies, transforming them in the process, as François Lyonnais and Chouméchet suggested in their creolization of theory. I quote, "If minor formations become method and theory, then new analytics will be brought to the foreground that creolize the universalisms we live with today from the bottom up and from the inside out." Thank you.